My stepdad Clive's old rocker pics, wild, shirtless, on a horse, hit me like a truck when I dug them up on his Texas ranch. I'm 21, flirting hard to mess with him. Mom's clueless, off at a seminar, while I turn up the heat. One snap sparked it, dangerous, electric. I'm Emily, 21, and I was up in the hayloft of the barn on Clive's Texas ranch, knee-deep in a dusty trunk, hunting for a rope to fix some harness gear. The place smelled like old wood and leather, and Mom was off in Austin at a librarian seminar, leaving me and my stepdad, Clive, a 56-year-old rancher with a past life as a rocker, to handle things. I shoved aside a moth-eaten blanket, and there it was, a faded photo album, its cover cracked, spilling out shots of Clive from the 80s. Long hair, leather vest, bass guitar slung low, cigarette dangling, standing on some grimy stage with a wild glint in his eyes. Another pic had him on a horse, lasso in hand, like a rock star cowboy straight out of a bad movie. My chest tightened, heat creeping up my neck. I couldn't look away. I grabbed the album, climbed down the ladder, and found Clive by the stables, wiping down saddles with a rag, his faded jeans streaked with dirt. The sun was dipping low, casting shadows over the pens, and I dropped the album on the hay-strewn table next to him, letting it thud loud. He glanced up, squinting, and I leaned in, smirking, saying I didn't know he was such a hotshot, rocking stages and riding horses like a pro. He froze, rag in hand, and flipped the cover open, staring at a shot of himself mid-riff, sweat glistening under stage lights. He said that was a long time ago, different guy, and went back to the saddle, but I caught the twitch in his jaw. I stepped closer, resting my hand on the table near his, and said he didn't look that different, still had that edge, didn't he? He wiped his hands harder, said I was digging up junk that didn't matter, but his eyes flicked to me, quick, sharp. I flipped to the horse pic, held it up, and said he must have had girls screaming for him, those moves were killer. He snorted, grabbed the album, set it aside, and said I was full of it, those days were dead. I leaned in, my elbow brushing his arm, and told him dead or not, he looked good, better than most guys I knew. He stopped, rag dangling, and looked at me, steady, like he was sizing me up. I turned it up, picking up a saddle strap, running my fingers along it slow, and asked if he'd ever played that bass for anyone special, maybe he could still strum a tune. He stepped closer, took the strap from me, his fingers grazing mine, and said I was stirring up nonsense, he hadn't touched a guitar in years. I grinned, bumped his shoulder with mine, and said I bet he could, those hands looked steady enough. He held the strap tight, didn't pull back, and said I didn't know what I was starting. His voice was low, rough. I laughed, said maybe I did, and stepped away, grabbing a pitchfork to move some hay, leaving him by the table. He stayed put, flipping through the album, and I forked hay into a pile, watching him out of the corner of my eye. He stopped on a shot, him on stage, mid-jump, and muttered something about being young and dumb. I dropped the pitchfork, walked back, and said young or not, he had it, still did. He shut the album, set it down hard, and said I'd better quit while I was ahead. I smirked, said ahead was boring, and headed to the house, leaving him with the saddles and those pics. I heard him kick a bucket as I went, and knew I'd hit a nerve, he wasn't shaking me off yet. The next morning, I wandered into the forge behind the barn, where Clive was hammering out a horseshoe, sparks flying off the anvil as the heat hit me like a wall. Mom was still in Austin, probably buried in seminar notes, and the ranch was ours. He was shirtless under a leather apron, sweat rolling down his arms, focused on the red-hot metal, and I leaned against the doorframe, watching him swing the hammer. I cleared my throat, loud, and he glanced up, wiping his forehead, asking what I wanted now. I stepped in, grabbed an old belt from a hook, one I'd seen in those pics, and tossed it on the workbench, saying I figured he'd need something cool to wear while he worked. He stopped, set the hammer down, and picked up the belt, running his thumb over the worn leather, saying it hadn't fit in decades, too much ranch life. I smirked, walked over, and leaned on the bench next to him, saying it'd still look good, he had that rocker vibe going strong. He shot me a look, sharp, and said I was digging up more ghosts, those days were gone. I nudged his elbow with mine, said gone or not, he was hotter than half the guys I'd met, bet he could still pull off that stage swagger. He grabbed a rag, wiped his hands, and said I was talking nonsense, nobody cared about that anymore. I stepped closer, resting my hand near his on the bench, and said I cared, those pics were fire, and he wasn't some washed-up has-been. He turned, his arm brushing mine, and said I was too young to get it, rock was dead by the time I showed up. I grinned, picked up the belt, held it out, and told him to try it on, prove he'd lost it. Then he took it, his fingers grazing mine slow, and slung it around his waist, buckling it tight, saying it was stupid. I'd laugh. I didn't laugh, just stepped in, my hip bumping his, and said it worked. Looked like he could ride or rock any time. He adjusted it, his hand near mine, and said I was pushing it. I winked, said pushing was my thing, and he hadn't stopped me yet. He grabbed a water bottle, took a swig, and offered it to me. Our fingers touched as I took it, and I sipped slow, holding his gaze, saying he must have been wild back then, still had that spark. He set the hammer back on the anvil, said wild got him nowhere, just a busted voice and bad knees, and leaned closer, his shoulder against mine. I handed the bottle back, my fingers lingering on his, and said bad knees didn't hide that edge, bet he could still make a crowd scream. He smirked, said I was full of it, but didn't pull away, his arm staying put, the forge heat mixing with something else. I turned it up, grabbing a pair of tongs, twirling them, and asked if he'd ever played bass shirtless like that for someone. Sounded like a hell of a show. He took the tongs, set them down, his hand brushing my wrist, and said I was fishing for stories I didn't need, those gigs were history. I stepped in, my chest an inch from his, and said history looked good on him, I'd scream for an encore. He gripped the bench, his knuckles tight, and said I was trouble. I laughed, said he liked trouble, and backed off, heading to the door. I told him to keep the belt, it suited him, and left him there, hammer in hand, knowing I'd lit something he couldn't douse yet. That evening, I was out by the pasture, hammering nails into a wobbly fence post, the sun dropping fast over the Texas plains. Mom was still in Austin, probably debating book catalogs, and Clive rolled up in his beat-up truck, hopping out with a coil of wire over his shoulder. He said I'd split the wood if I kept swinging like that, grabbed the hammer from me, his hand brushing mine, and started fixing it himself. I wiped sweat off my forehead, leaned against the post, and said he didn't have to swoop in, I wasn't hopeless. He smirked, drove a nail in clean, and said he wasn't risking a runaway cow because of me, ranch life wasn't a game. I grabbed the photo album from the truck bed where I'd stashed it, flipped it open, and held up a shot of him on stage, mid-riff, crowd roaring behind him. I said he didn't look like a game player back then, more like a heartbreaker. He stopped, glanced at it, and said that was noise, not life, kept hammering, but slower. I stepped closer, resting my elbow on the fence near his, and said noise or not, he owned it, bet he broke more than hearts with that vibe. He grabbed the wire, started looping it, his arm bumping mine, and said I was digging up dirt for no reason. I grinned, said dirt looked good on him, and flipped to the lasso pick, holding it out. He took it, his fingers grazing mine, and said I'd laugh if I saw him try that now, knees wouldn't take it. I leaned in, my shoulder brushing his, and said I wouldn't laugh, I'd cheer, bet he'd still nail it. He twisted the wire tight, didn't pull away, and said I was too easy to impress. I shot back that he made it easy, looking like that. He dropped the wire, turned to me, his hand landing on the post above mine, close, steady, and said I was stirring up nonsense again. His voice was low, gruff. I tilted my head, my hair brushing his arm, and told him nonsense suited him. Why'd he keep playing along? I stepped around him, grabbed a spare nail, and handed it over, my fingers lingering on his palm, saying he could hammer all he wanted, didn't hide that rocker spark. He took it, his grip firm, and drove it in, his elbow knocking mine, saying I was pushing buttons he didn't have anymore. I laughed, said those buttons worked fine, he just wouldn't admit it. He turned, his chest an inch from mine, and said I didn't get how dumb this could get. I smirked, bumped his hip with mine, and told him dumb was fun, he hadn't bailed yet. His hand stayed on the post, knuckles white, and I felt the air tighten, his shadow over me. Then a tractor roared to life across the field, neighbor fixing his own fence, engine loud as hell. I jumped back, grabbed the wire coil, and started looping it fast, saying we'd wake the whole county at this rate. Clive stepped away, picked up the hammer, and kept working, muttering about bad timing. I tossed him another nail, said he'd survive a little noise, rockers lived for it, and bolted to the house, yelling back to finish it himself. I hit the porch, heard him curse as the tractor drowned him out, and knew I'd left him hooked, reeling, not running. The next afternoon, I was in the pantry off the back porch, sorting through rusty cans of paint and jars of nails, looking for something to patch a hole in the barn wall. Mom was still at her seminar in Austin, and the ranch hummed with cicadas outside. I'd stacked half a dozen cans when Clive walked in, a glass of water in hand, his boots scuffing the wood floor. He said I'd trash the place digging like that, handed me the glass, his fingers brushing mine as I took it, cool against my sweaty palm. I sipped, set it down, and said he didn't have to check on me, I wasn't breaking anything yet. He leaned against the shelf, arms crossed, and said he wasn't taking chances. Last time I helped, he'd spent a day fixing it. I grabbed a dented can, shook it, and said he liked playing hero, bet he did back in his rocker days too. He snorted, said hero was a stretch, more like a guy with a loud amp, and shifted closer, his elbow near mine. I smirked, turned to face him, and said loud amps got attention, those pics proved he had plenty. He grabbed a jar of screws, started unscrewing it, and said I was stuck on those shots, nobody cared about them now. I stepped in, my hip bumping his, and told him I cared, bet he had girls chasing him with that cowboy strut. He stopped, set the jar down, his hand brushing my arm, and said I was making up stories. I grinned, said they weren't stories, just facts. He looked too good back then. I reached past him, grabbed a paintbrush from a shelf, letting my shoulder press his chest slow, and said he must have roped more than horses, those hands knew tricks. He took the brush, his fingers lingering on mine, and said I was fishing again, lasso days were over. I leaned in, my elbow on the shelf beside his, and told him over or not, he'd still catch something, bet he could rope me if he tried. He gripped the brush tight, turned to me, his knee knocking mine, and said I was asking for a mess. I winked, said messes were my favorite, he was good at them. He didn't pull back, just stood there, the pantry closing in, his shadow over me. I grabbed the water glass again, took a slow sip, and handed it back, my fingers sliding over his, saying he looked hot working that stage, still did, all sweaty out here. He took it, his grip firm, and said I was full of it, sweat wasn't sexy, just ranch work. I stepped closer, my chest an inch from his, and told him ranch work looked sexy on him, those pics didn't lie. He set the glass down hard, his hand hovering near my waist, and said I was pushing too far, his voice was rough, low. I bumped his hip with mine, said too far was where the fun started, he hadn't stopped me yet. He rubbed his neck, his elbow brushing my arm, and said I didn't get how this could blow up. I laughed, said blowing up sounded like his old gigs, wild and loud. Then his phone buzzed, calling from the seminar, asking if we'd found her spare charger. I froze, stepped back, and grabbed a can of paint, shaking it loud while he answered, saying he'd look later, everything was fine here. I mouthed to keep it quick, and he nodded, hanging up fast, muttering she had bad timing. I smirked, said timing didn't stop him, bet he'd rocked worse interruptions, and bolted out to the chicken coop, yelling back to finish sorting if he dared. I started tossing feed, hearing him kick a shelf inside, and knew I'd left him spinning, caught in my game, not ducking out. The next morning, I climbed into the cab of Clive's old pickup, the vinyl seat hot from the Texas sun, as we headed out to check the fence line along the back field. Mom was still in Austin, probably knee-deep in library workshops, and Clive tossed a toolbox in the bed, saying we'd better not lose any cattle while she was gone. I slid a dusty cassette, one of his old band demos, into the tape deck, cranking it up as we bounced down the dirt road, guitar riffs blasting through the crackly speakers. He glanced over, said I'd found the worst one. His voice was shot even then, and kept his eyes on the wheel. I smirked, tapped my fingers on the dash, and said it sounded hot to me, bet the crowd ate it up. He hit a rut, the truck jolting, and said crowds didn't know talent, just noise. I leaned over, my elbow brushing his arm, and told him noise looked good on him, still did. He shifted gears, his hand near my knee, and said I was stuck on that junk, nobody cared about tapes anymore. I slid closer, my thigh bumping his, and said I cared, bet he had fans screaming his name back then, all sweaty and wild. He smirked, said I was dreaming up a movie, he was just a guy with a bass, and slowed the truck, pulling up to a sagging fence post. I turned the volume up, leaned in, and said movie or not, he was the star, still had that fire. We hopped out, and I grabbed a pair of pliers from the toolbox, tossing them to him, my fingers grazing his as he caught them. He started twisting wire, and I stood close, holding the post steady, my shoulder brushing his, saying he must have rocked harder than this fence, bet he could still strut. He pulled the wire tight, his elbow knocking mine, and said I was full of it, strutting was for kids, not him. I grinned, bumped his hip with mine, and told him kids didn't look that good, those pics proved he had it. He grabbed a hammer, started pounding a nail, his arm flexing near me, and said I was stirring up nothing, his past was rustier than this post. I laughed, said rust suited him, made him sexier, and slid my hand along the post, brushing his wrist. He stopped, hammer mid-swing, and turned, his chest close, saying I was asking for trouble. I winked, said trouble was his specialty, bet he owned it back then. He dropped the hammer, grabbed the wire again, his hand near mine, and said I didn't get how dumb this was. I stepped in, my shoulder pinning his arm, and told him dumb looked hot on him. He wasn't bailing. He twisted the wire, his knee brushing my leg, and said I was making this a mess. I smirked, said messes were fun. He was still here. The truck rattled behind us, music still blaring, and I felt the heat off him, the field stretching wide around us. I turned the dial up, sliding closer, my hip against his, and said he could play that bass for me anytime, bet he'd kill it. He stopped, turned, his hand landing on the post above mine, and said I was pushing too hard. His voice was lonely, edgy. I bumped him again, said hard was his style, rocker or rancher. He owned it, and he didn't pull back, just stood there, breathing fast. Then headlights flashed in the distance, some truck turning off the highway, cutting through the dusk. I jumped back, grabbed the pliers, and started yanking wire, saying we'd better not get caught slacking. He cursed, picked up the hammer, and kept pounding, muttering about bad luck. I finished the post, hopped into the truck bed, and yelled for him to wrap it up. I'd fix the next one. He climbed in, started the engine, and I stayed in the back, leaning over the cab, shouting through the window that he'd better keep up. Rock stars didn't lag. He gunned it, the truck lurching, and I laughed, knowing I'd left him rattled, still in my grip. That night, I was in the kitchen, the air thick with the smell of coffee I'd just brewed, the ranch house quiet under a starry Texas sky. Mom was due back from Austin any hour, her seminar finally over, and I'd set the photo album on the counter, flipping through it while the pot gurgled. Clive walked in, boots off, wearing a faded band tee and jeans, grabbing a mug from the rack. He saw the album, asked why I was still on that kick. I smirked, slid it toward him, and said I couldn't get over how hot he looked, rocker and cowboy in one. He poured coffee, set the pot down, and said I was beating a dead horse. Those days were dust. I leaned on the counter, my elbow near his, and told him dust or not, he still had it, bet he could ride or riff any time. He took a sip, leaned against the sink, and said I was full of it. Nobody cared about old pics. I stepped closer, grabbed a mug, poured myself some, my shoulder brushing his arm, and said I cared. Those shots were fire, and he wasn't some washed-up relic. He smirked, set his mug down, his hand near mine, and said I was digging for compliments. I grinned, bumped his hip with mine, and told him he didn't need digging. He oozed it. He grabbed the album, flipped to a stage shot, and said I'd laugh if I heard him sing now. Voice was shot. I took the mug from his hand, sipped slow, my fingers grazing his, and said I'd cheer, bet he'd still kill it. I set the mug down, leaned in, my arm pressing his, and flipped to the lasso pick, saying he looked wild. Could he still rope me in? He took it, his fingers brushing mine, and said I was asking for a show that'd flop, knees wouldn't hold up. I stepped closer, my knee nudging his, and told him flops didn't suit him, he had too much spark. He set the pick down, his hand landing on the counter near mine, and said I was stirring up trouble. I winked, said trouble was his game, he hadn't quit yet. He shifted, his shoulder against mine, and said I was making this harder than it needed to be. I laughed, said hard was fun. He was still playing. I grabbed a spoon, stirred my coffee slow, letting my elbow bump his chest, and said he must have been a riot back then, still looked like one now. He took the spoon, set it aside, his hand brushing my wrist, and said I was fishing again. Those days were noise, not riots. I turned, my hip against his, and told him noise looked sexy on him, bet he could turn it up any time. He gripped the counter, his knuckles tight, and said I was pushing buttons. I stepped in, my chest an inch from his, and said buttons worked. Why'd he keep standing there? He didn't move, just watched me, his hand sliding closer, grazing my fingers. I turned it up, grabbing the album, holding up the horse pick, and stepped back, leaning against the table, saying he was a catch, still was. He followed, stood in front of me, his knee brushing mine, and said I was relentless. I smirked, bumped his leg with mine, and told him relentless got results. He hadn't bailed. I set the album down, slid my hand along the table, brushing his, and said he could walk away. He didn't, just shifted, his arm near my shoulder. I sat on the table edge, my legs dangling, and patted the spot next to me. He stepped closer, didn't sit, his hand landing on the table beside mine, close, steady. I leaned forward, my knee pressing his thigh, and said he liked this, why fight it? He shifted, his hand brushing my arm, and said I was making a mess. I laughed, said messes suited him, bet he thrived on them. He gripped the table, his fingers near mine, and said I didn't get how close this was. I tilted my head, my hair brushing his arm, and told him close was the point, he was still here. I slid off, stood, my chest brushing his arm, and grabbed his mug, taking a sip, handing it back slow, my fingers lingering on his. He took it, his grip firm, and said I was trouble. I stepped in, my hip against his, and said he liked trouble, he couldn't fake it. He set the mug down, turned, his shoulder pinning mine, and said I was driving this somewhere dumb. I bumped him, said dumb was his style, rocker or not. His hand dropped, hovering near my waist, and I leaned in, my arm against his chest, saying he could stop. He didn't, just stood there, breathing fast. I grabbed the album, flipped it shut, and slid it across the table, my hand brushing his, saying he was too good at this, still had that edge. He stepped closer, his knee between mine, and said I was asking for it. I smirked, said he was giving it, why else stay? Then tires crunched gravel outside a mom's car, back early, headlights slicing through the window. I froze, stepped back, and Clive grabbed his mug, turning to the sink like nothing happened. The door flew open, Mom stormed in, bags in hand, and stopped, staring at us, me by the table, him too close, album out. She dropped her stuff, voice sharp, asking what the hell this was, why was he hovering like that? I said it was nothing, just coffee, but she saw the pics, grabbed them, and yelled he'd been sneaking around, she wasn't blind. Clive stammered it was just talk, but she turned on me, saying I'd pushed it, then back to him, screaming this was done. She bolted upstairs, shouting for me to pack. We were leaving, not staying on his damn ranch another night. I stood there, heart pounding, as she yanked suitcases from the closet, yelling he could keep his land. She was taking me home. Clive grabbed his keys, said she was overreacting, but she shoved past him, tossing my boots at me, saying we were out, now. I followed, bag in hand, as she dragged us to the car, slamming the door, leaving him in the kitchen, album still open, coffee cold.